Chapter 8. But in the morning Brian had changed his mind and couldn't explain why. He had skinned the deer and rolled the hide to stretch it later. It would keep for a day or two, and the dog had eaten the heart and liver and lungs in one sitting. Easily 5 pounds of meat. And then chewed on scraps while Brian cut the rest of the deer into manageable hunks. 2 back legs and 2 front. The meat from along the spine, the tenderloin, which was the best meat, but on this buck very small. He had heard somewhere that wolves could eat up to 20 pounds of meat in a single meal, and he thought the dog was coming close. She just kept eating. Brian cut pieces of raw meat off and threw them to the dog, and even when her stomach was so distended, Brian was worried about it stretching her skin and opening the wound. Still, she ate. He put a stick by the fire and hung the meat to cook, and ate the tenderloin, probably 3 pounds, until it was gone, and then roasted the front shoulder and ate some of that. But the dog didn't stop until Brian finally quit handing her meat. Then she dropped like a stone and was asleep. When her head hit the ground, sound asleep, gone. Brian smiled and squatted by the fire and studied the dog sleeping. He had watched her during the day, learning about her, amazed at how the dog keyed to him. And he keyed to the dog. When the dog was sitting up, looking around, Brian found himself watching her, watching for a reaction, depending on her for warning, in case of something came. It was all new, the bond, and he wondered how he would have lived his whole life, and never had this closeness with another species, with the dog. It had been a great loss. He decided he would never be without a dog again. In some ways the dog filled a hole in his life, filled a loneliness he had never known existed, and he wondered if it had always been the same for men. If somewhere back in time in a cave a man took a wolf pup and sat him down and thought, "There, my life is better now." Well, not exactly that way, but something like that. Something ancient man had recognized, some connection. But when he thought about it, it seemed that almost all cultures had dogs with them to work and enjoy, and he shuddered, to eat. He went to sleep sitting by the fire, thinking of that the next day they would lie around, eat more of the meat, and then dry, or try to dry, into jerky, what little there was left. Dawn, first light, found him packing the canoe to leave. So much of what drove Brian now was instinct, feelings, and he used to call hunches, but what he thought of as logical flows of information from his subconsciousness, based on knowledge that he sometimes did not quite understand. Usually it was right, and he had learned to trust it. When he awakened this morning, an inner force had made him pack the canoe and get ready to head out north, where he thought the dog had come from. Something pulled him north, and now there was a distinct urgency he could still not understand, except that it had something to do with the dog, and the wound, and the fact that he was sure a bear had done it. And there was no reason for the dog to leave its camp simply because a bear had hurt it. Unless. And he could not think of the unless with logic, because there was no logic to it. Just the urge to go, make a start. So he packed the canoe, and when it was packed, he tied cord to both back quarters of the deer, to hang them over in the water. The coolness of the lakes and rivers would help keep the meat fresh for at least a day. Then he slid the canoe sideways to the bank and signaled with his hand for the dog to jump in. By the time the sun was over the top of the trees and warming his back, he was stroking the canoe across the lake. He hadn't in mind if there was any true plan at all in his thoughts to find the Creek camp and ask him if there were other trappers nearby and see if they had a problem with the bear. That was as far as his thinking went, along with the fact that it would be nice to meet Kay Gwadash. He should have been happy, or at least felt pleasure at going to see his old friends. But instead he found himself pulling harder at the paddle at all times. Clawing ahead, frustrated at pulling the 2 deer legs through the water slowed the canoe. Not smiling, not happy at all, but reaching forward harder and harder with the paddle, ripping the water back along the canoe. End of lake, another beaver dam. Over it, reload, back in the water. Dog in the canoe, tearing down the stream, looking ahead, always ahead, not even thinking, just pulling the canoe forward. End of lake. Beaver dam. Stream through swamps. More dams. More work over them. Stroking, stroking, to yet another lake. And then dark. He had not stopped the way he usually did, still and light to find a place. He took a clearing with a slight angle, and stumbled around in the dark to find wood, and it was truly late by the time he was ready to get water on to boil and cut pieces of meat to make a stew. He gathered more wood in the dark, made a hot fire to get the water boiling as fast as possible, and did his daily gear check by firelight. When he finished, the stew had boiled, and he drank the broth, ate the meat, fed the dog from the rest of the back leg, and lay down to rest. He ached and was tired from paddling hard. Sleep should have come fast, but he lay on the grass, his mind tumbling, wondering how far there was yet to go. He had thought it was over 30 miles, from the way the camp had been described, but he had come close to 30 miles today, and didn't seem to be near a big lake, although a lot of that travel had been back and forth because the country was flat and the streams wandered. He knew for a fact that at one point he had paddled 2 miles east and west to go less than half a mile north. The dog seemed to be affected by his mood, and even after eating did not lie peacefully and sleep as she had the night before, but instead sat near Brian, almost leaning against him, looking into the darkness and periodically whining softly in the direction it was looking north. Something there, Brian thought. There was something up there the dog knew about and didn't like, and he knew it must have been what caused the wound. And the way the dog was looking, trying to see through the darkness, her nostrils flaring as she tried to get a smell, ears perked for any sound, whatever it must be getting close. Brian threw some leaves on the coals to make bug smoke and sleep, finally on the ground with no shelter except for a polar fleece pullover draped over his side. He was up before dawn, starting the fire again, heating water to drink, feeding the dog, a bit of meat, and into the canoe and paddling at first light. At first he was stiff and his back was sore, but the lake was about a mile long, and by the time he reached the outlet at the end of the stiffness was gone, and he was back to clawing with the paddle. More beaver dams, more streams, another lake, and then another series of dams and streams and swamps, and then a change. At first he wasn't sure what it was. Something was different. It was the same water, the same canoe, and he paddled the same way, but there was a change around. And when he was moving along the edge of a stream, under an overhang, he realized it was. The woods were different here. There were less sound, less small movement. Before, there's always been something happening, some indication of nature, and here it had changed. A quieting that wasn't there before, and not caused by the canoe passing. Before, the canoe had no effect at all. But he hadn't seen a moose in hours, and before that, they had almost been common. He hadn't seen birds, but more, hadn't heard them either. There was a man here. He was getting close to man. In another mile the stream was following, widened into a shallow entrance to a large lake that led away to the north. It was at least 5 miles long, and widened rapidly to the left and right as he entered it, and then seemed to narrow to a point at the end, 5 miles away. The lake was shaped like an arrowhead, or nearly so, and more, even in the afternoon heat, mist. He thought he could see a large island at the far end. It was the right lake, where his friends were camped, and he pulled the remaining deer leg back into the canoe to make the paddling easier, and started pulling for the island. But it was as if the fates, having been kind to him for so long, decided to make up for it. A breeze started coming from the north, with clouds, and it quickly turned into a wind, and then a strong wind hitting him on the head. And when he had been making 3 or 4 some miles an hour, he was now down to barely 1, and some chop was splashing over the bow. He slid sideways to the left, close to shore, but while the chop diminished and he was no longer shipping water, the wind was still as strong, and the trip across the lake that he thought would only take a little more than an hour was suddenly a 6-hour pull, and that only with hard work. His stomach was full of good meat and water, and he was strong. He kept the pace up, accepting the 3/4 of miles an hour as it came to him, and after 4 hours of only a mile and a half from the island, when a new stranger's hit him. The wind was blowing straight from the island to him, all his way across the lake, and yet he smelled nothing. If they were camped there on the island, they would be burning fires for cooking and heating, but he could smell nothing. Not the slightest whiff of wood smoke. The wind was blowing directly at him from the island, right across him, and there was no odor. And the dog, she was up now, on all fours, whimpering more loudly than ever, mixing those sounds with low growls, her ears up, then down, then back up again, listening, then hiding, then listening again, aggressive but worried. Brian paused, and something made him reach out and take a broad head out of his quiver, and lay it across the boat, even though the moment without paddling cost him his forward motion. He thought, "This is silly, I'm being a warrior," but positioned the boat close to him just to be the same. Just the same. Then dug with the paddle again, pulling hard for the island, the dog whimpering and growling. I just wish, Brian thought, I could smell their smoke.